Elena Voss ran through the crowded street with her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, footsteps chased at the same fast pace, never falling behind, never slowing down. She did not look back. She did not need to. She already knew who it was. Marcus had found her again. 3 months had passed since she left him. 3 months of looking over her shoulder every time she stepped outside. 3 months of telling herself the fear would fade with time. It had not faded. It had only waited, quiet and patient, for a moment like this one. Her shoes slapped against the wet pavement as she pushed past strangers who barely noticed her, too busy with their own lives to see the panic on her face. She turned a corner sharply, hoping to lose him in the maze of the city, but his voice called her name from somewhere close behind, sharp and demanding. "Elena, stop running from me." She did not stop. She could not stop. Something inside her told her that if she slowed down even for a second, he would catch her, and this time there would be no escape. Ahead of her stood a tall glass building, its entrance guarded by a wide glass door that reflected the gray afternoon sky. She had never been inside it before. She did not know who worked there or what waited beyond that door. All she knew was that it was close, and closer meant safer. She pushed through the entrance without thinking, her breath coming out in short, desperate gasps. A woman at the front desk looked up in surprise, but Elena did not stop to explain herself. She saw an open door at the end of a quiet hallway and ran toward it, driven by pure instinct rather than any plan. She burst through that door without knocking, without pausing, without any thought for what might be on the other side. The room went silent. 4 men in dark suits turned to look at her, their expressions shifting from calm conversation to sharp alertness in an instant. One of them, a broad man standing near the window, reached instinctively toward his jacket before stopping himself. At the head of a long wooden table sat a man who did not move at all. He simply watched her with dark, unreadable eyes, as if her sudden arrival was nothing more than an interesting puzzle. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, chest heaving, the cold reality of what she had just done crashing over her. She had run into a stranger's private office, uninvited, interrupting what looked like an important meeting. Her mind raced to find words, an apology, an explanation, anything. "I'm sorry," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to. There's a man outside. He's following me. I just needed somewhere to." The man at the head of the table raised one hand, a small, quiet gesture, and the room seemed to obey it instantly. The broad man near the window relaxed his stance. The others straightened, waiting. "What is your name?" the man asked. His voice was calm, low, and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command attention. "Elena," she said. "Elena Voss." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her wide eyes, her trembling hands, the fear that had not yet left her face. Then he looked past her, toward the hallway she had just run through, as if he could already sense the danger she had brought with her. "And the man following you," he said, "does he have a name?" "Marcus," she whispered. "He won't leave me alone. I left him months ago, and he still won't stop." The man at the table nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He rose from his chair with an unhurried calm that felt strange given the tension in the room. He was tall, dressed in a dark gray suit that fit him perfectly, and he moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made the other men in the room instinctively step aside. "My name is Dante Moretti," he said. "This is my office." Elena's stomach dropped. She had heard that name before, whispered in conversations she was never meant to hear, spoken with a mixture of fear and respect by people who worked in this part of the city. Dante Moretti was not simply a businessman. He was a man whose influence stretched far beyond ordinary offices and ordinary meetings, a man people spoke of carefully, as if saying his name too loudly might summon trouble. She had run straight into the office of a man the whole city feared. "I'm so sorry," she said again, taking a step back. "I'll leave right now. I didn't know this was—" "Stay," Dante said simply. The single word stopped her in place. It was not a request. It carried the same quiet authority as everything else about him, an expectation that people did not argue with what he said. Outside, faintly, she could hear a familiar voice growing louder, arguing with someone near the front desk. Marcus had reached the building. He was asking the receptionist where she had gone, his tone rising with impatience and anger, the same tone Elena had heard too many times before, back when she still lived under his control. Dante's eyes moved toward the sound, and something in his expression shifted, sharp and focused, like a predator noticing movement in the grass. "Sit down," he told Elena, nodding toward a chair near the window. "You are safe here." She hesitated only a moment before her legs, weak with exhaustion and fear, carried her to the chair. She sank into it, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to steady her breathing while her mind spun with disbelief at where she had ended up. One of the men in suits, the broad one who had reached for his jacket earlier, looked toward Dante with a silent question in his eyes. Dante gave a small shake of his head, and the man stayed where he was, though his attention remained fixed on the hallway. The voice outside grew louder still. Marcus was demanding answers now, insisting that he had seen a woman run into this building, refusing to be told that no one matching her description had come through the front doors. Elena's hands trembled in her lap. She had spent so many nights convincing herself that she was finally free of him, that distance and time had closed that chapter of her life. Yet here he was again, refusing to accept an ending she had already chosen. Dante walked slowly toward the door of his office, each step deliberate, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world despite the chaos brewing just beyond the walls. Before stepping into the hallway, he turned back to look at Elena one final time. "Wait here," he said. "This will not take long." Then he stepped out, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving Elena alone in a room filled with strangers, her heart still pounding, uncertain whether she had escaped one danger only to walk directly into another. The three remaining men exchanged glances but said nothing. Elena stared at the closed door, straining to hear what was happening beyond it, catching only fragments of Marcus's raised voice and, beneath it, Dante's calm, even tone, a voice that never seemed to rise no matter how heated the argument outside became. She did not know this man. She did not know what kind of life he led behind the polished walls of this office, or what kind of power allowed him to silence an entire room with a single raised hand. All she knew was that for the first time in 3 months, the fear inside her chest had shifted into something else entirely, something she could not yet name. It felt, strangely, like the beginning of safety. But even as that thought crossed her mind, another followed close behind it, quiet and uneasy. She had run from one dangerous man, directly into the world of another, a man whose calm was somehow more unsettling than any anger could have been. Whatever happened next, Elena understood one thing clearly, as she sat in that unfamiliar office, waiting for the sound of Marcus's voice to fade away. Her life had just changed, and there was no going back to the way things were before she opened that door. Through the thick wooden door, the voices continued, rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Elena pressed her hands together in her lap, trying to steady herself, trying to remember how to breathe normally after weeks of holding her breath every time she stepped outside her small flower shop. She thought back to how it had started with Marcus, how charming he had seemed in the beginning, how easily she had believed his promises. It had taken her a long time to understand that his kindness had strings attached, that every gift came with an expectation, that every argument ended with her apologizing for things that were never her fault. Leaving him had been the hardest decision of her life, and rebuilding herself afterward had taken every bit of strength she had left. She had told herself, over and over, that one day the fear would stop following her. Standing in this unfamiliar office now, listening to a man she barely knew handle the very danger she had run from, she wondered if that day had somehow arrived without warning. The broad man near the window finally spoke, breaking the silence in the room. His voice was low and careful, meant only for her. "You are safe in here," he said. "Mr. Moretti does not let trouble walk through these doors." Elena looked up at him, unsure how to respond. She did not know if she should feel relieved or frightened by those words. A man like Dante Moretti did not earn a reputation like his by being harmless, yet in this moment, his presence felt like the only solid ground beneath her feet. Outside, the argument seemed to shift. Marcus's voice, once loud and insistent, grew quieter, almost hesitant. Elena strained to understand what had changed, but the door was thick enough to swallow the details, leaving her only with the shape of the conversation and none of its words. Minutes passed like hours. Elena's fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve, a habit she had carried since childhood, whenever nerves overtook her. She glanced at the other men in the room, searching their faces for some sign of what might happen next, but they gave nothing away, standing still and composed, as if this kind of interruption happened often enough to no longer surprise them. Finally, the door opened again, and Dante stepped back inside, his expression unreadable, his suit still perfectly straight despite whatever had just taken place in the hallway. He looked at Elena for a long moment before speaking. "He is gone," he said simply. Elena felt the tension drain from her shoulders, replaced almost immediately by confusion. Gone? Just like that? "For now," Dante said. "Men like him do not disappear because they are asked nicely. But he understands, at least for today, that this is not a place he should return to." Elena studied his face, trying to understand the calm certainty behind his words. She had expected shouting, maybe even the kind of confrontation that ended in something worse. Instead, Marcus had simply left, and this stranger stood before her, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. "Thank you," she said quietly, unsure what else to offer a man who had just stepped between her and the fear that had followed her for months. Dante studied her in return, his dark eyes searching her face, as if trying to understand exactly what kind of danger had walked into his office that afternoon, and exactly what he intended to do about it now that it had. The receptionist, a young woman named Grace, still stood frozen near her desk when Dante walked past her into the hallway earlier that day, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. She had seen many visitors come and go through this building, but never one as agitated as the man who had just pushed past her, demanding to know where a woman named Elena had disappeared to. Marcus had barely glanced at Grace when he stormed inside, his eyes scanning the lobby with the frantic energy of someone unwilling to accept that his search might fail. When Grace tried to tell him no one matching that description had entered, he raised his voice sharply enough that two other employees near the elevators had turned to look. That was the moment Dante stepped into the hallway. He did not raise his own voice. He did not need to. His presence alone seemed to shift the air in the room, drawing every eye toward him the instant he appeared. Marcus turned, momentarily confused by the sudden authority radiating from a man he had never seen before, a man whose calm demeanor did not match the tension coiled beneath his words. "Can I help you with something?" Dante asked, his tone even, almost polite, though there was an edge beneath it that made Grace instinctively take a step back behind her desk. "I'm looking for someone," Marcus said, trying to steady his own voice now that he had an audience beyond the receptionist. "A woman. She ran in here a few minutes ago." "This is a private office building," Dante said. "Visitors are required to have appointments." "She's not a visitor," Marcus snapped. "She's mine. I need to talk to her." Something flickered behind Dante's calm expression at those words. Something sharp and immediate, though his voice remained just as level as before. "She's mine" was not a phrase he took lightly, not from a stranger standing in his own lobby, chasing a woman who had run into his office with fear written across every line of her face. "I don't think she wants to talk to you," Dante said, "and I think it would be best if you left." Marcus's jaw tightened. He was not a small man, and he was clearly not used to being told what to do, especially not by someone he had never met before. He took a step closer, perhaps expecting Dante to back away the way most people did when faced with his temper. Dante did not move. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice rising again, frustration bleeding into every word. "No," Dante said simply. "But I know exactly who you are to her, and that is enough for me to ask you to leave." The two other employees near the elevators exchanged uneasy glances, clearly sensing the tension building between the two men, though neither of them fully understood the weight behind Dante's calm words. Grace, still standing behind her desk, had worked in this building long enough to recognize the particular kind of stillness that settled over Dante whenever he was serious about something. She had seen it only a handful of times before, and each time, it meant the person on the receiving end of it would not enjoy what came next. Marcus opened his mouth to argue further, but before he could speak, the broad man from Dante's office, whose name was Victor, stepped quietly into the lobby, positioning himself a few steps behind Dante without a word. He did not need to say anything. His presence alone communicated exactly what Dante's calm tone had already implied. Marcus looked between the two men, his confidence faltering for the first time since he had entered the building. Whatever instinct guided people away from real danger seemed to finally awaken in him, though pride kept him from admitting defeat outright. "This isn't over," Marcus muttered, though his voice had lost most of its earlier force. "For today it is," Dante said. "If you come back here, or anywhere near her again, you will not find me nearly as patient as I am right now." There was no threat shouted, no dramatic gesture, only the quiet certainty of a man who never made promises he did not intend to keep. Marcus stared at him a moment longer, searching for some crack in that composure, some sign that the warning was empty. He found none. With one final glance toward the hallway where Elena had disappeared, he turned and walked out through the glass doors, his footsteps echoing across the lobby, until the door closed behind him. Grace let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Dante glanced at her briefly, offering the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement of her composure during the encounter, before turning back toward his office. Inside, Elena still sat exactly where he had left her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for news she was almost afraid to hear. When Dante walked back in and told her that Marcus was gone, relief washed over her so suddenly that her eyes filled with tears. She quickly tried to blink away. "You don't have to hide that," Dante said, noticing the way she pressed her fingers against her eyes. "Fear like that does not disappear just because the danger walks out the door." Elena looked up at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. Most people she knew had grown tired of her caution over the past few months, unable to understand why she still flinched at loud voices or unexpected footsteps behind her. Dante, a man she had known for less than half an hour, seemed to understand it without needing an explanation. "I don't even know how to thank you properly," she said. "You didn't have to help me. You don't even know me." "You needed help," Dante said. That was enough of a reason. He studied her a moment longer before adding, "But I don't think it's wise for you to walk home alone today, not until we know he isn't waiting somewhere nearby." Elena hesitated. The idea of accepting more help from a man whose reputation carried such heavy weight felt strange, even dangerous in its own way. Yet the alternative, walking out onto the street alone with the possibility of Marcus waiting somewhere unseen, felt far worse. "I have a car outside," Dante continued, as though sensing her hesitation. "My driver will take you home. No one will bother you." "I don't want to be any trouble," Elena said quietly. "You're not," Dante said. "Trouble already found you today. I'm simply making sure it doesn't find you again, before you're safely behind your own door." There was something in the calm certainty of his words that made arguing feel pointless. Elena nodded slowly, gathering the last of her composure as she rose from the chair, her legs still slightly unsteady from the earlier chase through the city streets. Dante led her out of the office, past Grace's desk, where the young receptionist offered Elena a small, sympathetic smile as she passed. Outside, a sleek black car waited at the curb, its driver already standing beside the open back door, as though he had been summoned before Dante even gave the order. "His name is Ellis," Dante said. "He'll take you wherever you need to go." Elena turned to face him one last time, before stepping into the car, unsure how to properly say goodbye to a man who had just changed the course of her entire day, possibly the course of her entire life. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling insufficient no matter how many times she repeated them. Dante gave a small nod, his expression unreadable once more, though something in his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "Get home safely, Elena Voss." She climbed into the car, and Ellis closed the door gently behind her, before walking around to the driver's seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Elena turned to look back at the building, catching one last glimpse of Dante standing near the entrance, watching the car disappear into traffic, with an expression she could not quite read. The ride home passed mostly in silence. Ellis did not ask questions, and Elena did not offer explanations, both of them seemingly aware that some things were better left unspoken for now. She stared out the window at the familiar streets of her neighborhood, streets that had felt unsafe just hours earlier, now feeling different somehow, though she could not explain exactly why. When the car finally stopped outside her small apartment building, Ellis turned briefly to look at her. "Mr. Moretti asked me to make sure you got inside safely," he said. "I'll wait until you're through the door." Elena thanked him and stepped out of the car, walking quickly to the entrance of her building, very aware of his patient eyes watching from the car until she disappeared inside. Once she was safely in her small flat, she leaned against the closed door and finally allowed herself to breathe fully, the tension of the entire day slowly draining from her shoulders. She thought about the strange turn her afternoon had taken, from running in fear through crowded streets to sitting inside the private office of a man the city spoke of in careful whispers. She thought about the calm certainty in his voice when he told Marcus to leave, and the quiet kindness underneath his composed exterior when he insisted on sending her home safely. Elena did not know what to make of Dante Moretti. She did not know whether to feel grateful or wary, safe or uncertain. But as she settled onto her couch that evening, replaying the events of the day in her mind, she realized that for the first time in months, she had gone an entire evening without checking the locks on her door more than once. Somewhere across the city, in his quiet office long after his men had gone home for the evening, Dante sat behind his desk, staring at nothing in particular, his thoughts unexpectedly occupied by the frightened woman who had burst into his life that afternoon. He was not a man who allowed distractions, not in a world where distraction could cost him everything he had built, yet something about Elena Voss had settled into his mind in a way he could not easily shake. He thought of the fear in her eyes when she first stumbled through his door, and the flicker of relief that replaced it once she understood she was safe. He thought of the quiet dignity she carried despite everything she had clearly been through, the way she had thanked him sincerely rather than simply accepting his help as though it were owed to her. Dante had spent years building walls around himself, walls meant to keep the dangerous parts of his life separate from anything soft or vulnerable. Yet as he sat alone in his office that night, he found himself wondering, almost against his own will, whether he would see Elena Voss again, and whether some part of him hoped that he would. He did not yet know that Marcus had no real intention of staying away, nor did he know how deeply his own decision to help a stranger that afternoon would soon test every rule he had built his life around. The next morning, Elena woke earlier than usual, her body still carrying the tension of the previous day, even though her mind told her the danger had passed. She lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, replaying the strange sequence of events that had brought a man like Dante Moretti into her life. She had a flower shop to open, deliveries to prepare, and customers who expected her to be steady and cheerful behind the counter, none of whom knew anything about the fear that had chased her through the streets the day before. Elena forced herself out of bed, showered, and dressed in her usual work clothes, trying to convince herself that today would be an ordinary day. It was not. As she walked the short distance from her apartment to her shop, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, checking corners and doorways out of habit, searching for any sign of Marcus lurking nearby. The street was quiet, filled only with the usual morning traffic and a few early commuters hurrying toward the train station, yet her body remained tense, unwilling to fully trust the calm around her. When she reached her shop, she unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh flowers that always managed to settle her nerves, at least a little. She busied herself with the morning routine, arranging new deliveries of roses and lilies, sweeping the front entrance, preparing the small shop for the day ahead. An hour into her work, a black car pulled up outside, the same sleek vehicle that had driven her home the evening before. Elena's heart skipped, uncertain whether to feel relief or renewed alarm, until she saw Ellis step out from the driver's seat and approach the shop with a small, polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Voss," he said as he entered. "Mr. Moretti wanted to make sure you arrived safely and that nothing unusual happened overnight." Elena blinked in surprise. "I'm fine," she said. "Nothing happened. Please, tell him thank you again for everything yesterday." Ellis nodded, though he did not immediately turn to leave. "He also wanted me to give you this," he said, holding out a small card with a phone number written neatly across it. "In case you ever need help again, anytime, day or night." Elena took the card carefully, studying the elegant handwriting, unsure what to say. It felt strange, receiving this kind of careful attention from a man she barely knew, yet it also stirred something warm inside her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. She had grown so used to being alone with her fear that having someone, anyone, take it seriously, felt almost foreign. "Thank you," she said again, tucking the card into her apron pocket. "Please tell him I appreciate it." Ellis gave a small nod and left the shop, and Elena stood there for a long moment, staring at the door as it closed behind him, wondering exactly what kind of world she had stumbled into the day before, and whether stepping further into it would prove wise or reckless. Throughout the rest of the day, she found her thoughts drifting back to Dante more than once, to the calm authority in his voice, the quiet kindness beneath his composed exterior, the way he had handled a dangerous situation without ever raising his voice or losing control. She told herself it was simply gratitude, nothing more. Yet she could not fully convince herself that gratitude alone explained the warmth she felt whenever she thought of him. By the time evening arrived and she closed the shop for the night, Elena felt something she had not felt in months, a fragile sense of safety settling over her, thin as it was, built on the actions of a man the rest of the city feared. She did not yet know how complicated that safety would soon become, nor did she know how quickly her quiet, ordinary life would begin to intertwine with his. 2 weeks passed, and Elena began to notice small things she could not quite explain. A man she did not recognize sometimes lingered across the street from her shop, reading a newspaper he never seemed to turn the page of. A different car, dark and unremarkable, occasionally parked near the corner for an hour before disappearing again. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, her nerves still raw from everything that had happened with Marcus, but the pattern repeated too often to dismiss as coincidence. One afternoon, after closing the shop earlier than usual, she decided to confront whatever was happening, rather than continue wondering in silence. She walked directly toward the man with the newspaper, her arms crossed, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and determination. "Are you following me?" she asked bluntly, startling him enough that he lowered the paper in surprise. The man, younger than she expected, with a friendly enough face despite his serious expression, hesitated before answering honestly. "Mr. Moretti asked us to keep an eye on the shop," he admitted, "just to make sure nothing happens while he's not around." Elena's mouth fell open slightly. "For 2 weeks? Without telling me?" "He didn't want to worry you," the man said. "He just wanted you safe." Elena did not know whether to feel comforted or unsettled by this revelation. Part of her appreciated the concern, the quiet, careful way Dante had tried to protect her without asking for anything in return. Another part of her felt a flicker of unease at the idea of being watched without her knowledge, however good the intention behind it. She thanked the man stiffly and walked away, her mind spinning with questions she needed answered directly, not through second-hand explanations from strangers stationed outside her shop. That evening, she pulled the small card Ellis had given her out of her apron pocket and dialed the number written across it, her fingers trembling slightly as the phone rang. Dante answered on the second ring, his voice calm and familiar despite the weeks that had passed since she last heard it. "Elena," he said, and something about the way he said her name made her nerves settle, if only slightly. "You've had someone watching my shop," she said, skipping any greeting. "For 2 weeks. Why didn't you tell me?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Dante answered. "I didn't want you to feel like you were being controlled," he said. "I only wanted to make sure you were safe until I was certain the danger had passed." "I would rather know," Elena said, her voice firmer now. "I've spent enough of my life not knowing things, being kept in the dark by someone who claimed it was for my own good. I don't want that again, not even from you." Another pause followed, longer this time, as though Dante were carefully considering her words, rather than simply offering an easy apology. "You're right," he finally said. "I should have told you. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected excuses, perhaps even mild irritation at being questioned. Yet instead, he had simply accepted responsibility without argument. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it mattered more than she expected. "Can we talk?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "In person, not like this." "Of course," Dante said, "wherever you're comfortable." They agreed to meet the following evening at a quiet cafe near her shop, a neutral space, far removed from the tension of his office, or the memory of the day Marcus had chased her through the streets. When Elena arrived the next evening, she found Dante already seated at a corner table, dressed more casually than she had seen him before, in a simple dark sweater that somehow made him look less like the powerful figure the city whispered about, and more like an ordinary man carrying quiet burdens of his own. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down across from him. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Elena replied, folding her hands on the table. "I wanted to understand why you've been so careful about protecting me, even after everything settled down. Marcus hasn't come near the shop in weeks." Dante studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression unusually open, as though he were deciding how honest to be with her. "The world I live in," he began slowly, "does not leave much room for gentleness. Every relationship I have is built on strategy, loyalty, or fear. People respect me because they are afraid of what happens if they don't." He paused, glancing down at the cup of coffee in front of him before continuing. "The day you ran into my office, you weren't afraid of me. You were afraid of him. For the first time in a long while, someone needed something from me that had nothing to do with my reputation or my influence. You just needed help." Elena listened quietly, surprised by the vulnerability in his words, a vulnerability she had not expected from a man everyone described as untouchable. "I don't get many chances to simply be decent to someone," Dante continued. "Watching over your shop wasn't about control. It was the only way I knew how to make sure you stayed safe without inserting myself into your life more than you wanted." "You could have just asked me," Elena said gently. "I know that now," Dante admitted. "I'm not used to asking. I'm used to deciding and acting." There was something disarming about his honesty, about the quiet admission that a man who commanded entire rooms with a single gesture still struggled with something as simple as open communication. Elena found herself softening toward him, her earlier frustration fading into something closer to understanding. "Tell me about your life," she said. "Not the version everyone whispers about, the real one." Dante hesitated, clearly unused to being asked such a direct question, yet something about Elena's steady, patient gaze seemed to invite honesty rather than caution. He told her, carefully at first, about the family business he had inherited far younger than he ever expected, about the responsibilities that came with a world he had not chosen but could not walk away from either. He spoke of the isolation that came with power, the way people around him were either afraid of him or trying to use him, rarely both able and willing to simply see him as a person. Elena listened without judgment, recognizing in his words an echo of her own isolation, the years she had spent hiding her fear behind cheerful smiles for customers who never noticed anything was wrong. They were different people, living entirely different lives, yet somehow, sitting across from each other in that quiet cafe, they understood each other in a way neither had expected. "I never wanted this life," Dante admitted quietly, "but I couldn't walk away from it without leaving people I care about exposed to worse consequences. So I stayed, and I built walls around myself instead." "And now?" Elena asked softly. Dante looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded flickering behind his dark eyes. "Now I'm sitting across from someone who ran into my life by accident, and somehow, for the first time in years, those walls don't feel as necessary as they used to." Elena's breath caught slightly at his words, unsure how to respond to something so unexpectedly sincere. She had come into this meeting prepared to address boundaries, to express her discomfort at being watched without her knowledge. She had not expected to leave feeling as though she understood this dangerous, complicated man far better than she had before, nor had she expected the warmth that settled in her chest at the thought of him lowering his guard, even slightly, in her presence. Over the following weeks, their meetings became more frequent, though never anything Elena would have called a formal arrangement. Dante would stop by her shop occasionally, always careful not to draw attention, always respectful of the boundaries she set. They would talk over coffee, or sometimes simply walk together through quiet parts of the city after her shop closed for the evening, conversations flowing easily between them despite the vastly different worlds they came from. Elena found herself looking forward to these moments more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. There was something steady about Dante's presence, something that made her feel protected without feeling controlled. a balance she had never experienced in her relationship with Marcus. Dante never pushed her, never demanded more of her time or attention than she offered freely, and that restraint, more than anything else, helped the fragile trust between them grow stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street lined with old brick buildings, Elena finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind for weeks. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of everyone in this city, why did helping me matter so much to you?" Dante considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you didn't ask me to be someone I'm not," he said. "You didn't want my money, my influence, or my protection out of fear. You just needed help, and once the danger passed, you still treated me like an ordinary person capable of decency. No one has done that in a very long time." Elena felt something shift inside her chest at his words, a recognition of the same loneliness she had carried since leaving Marcus, the fear of being valued only for what she could provide, rather than who she truly was. In Dante, she saw someone carrying that same isolation, hidden beneath layers of power and reputation that few people ever managed to see past. "I'm glad I ran into your office that day," she admitted quietly, "even though it terrified me at the time." Dante glanced at her, something warm flickering behind his usually guarded expression. "So am I," he said simply. They walked in comfortable silence after that, both of them aware that something had shifted between them, something neither was quite ready to name yet, though both could feel its quiet, steady presence settling into the space between their footsteps. Neither of them yet knew that this fragile, growing connection would soon be tested far more severely than either could have anticipated, nor did they know how quickly the peace they had built together would be threatened by the return of the very danger that had brought them together in the first place. A few days later, Elena invited Dante to her small apartment for the first time, nervous about what he might think of her modest space, compared to the grand office and sleek cars that surrounded his usual life. She had spent the afternoon nervously tidying her already tidy flat, arranging flowers from her shop in a simple vase on the table, unsure why his opinion of her home mattered so much to her. When he arrived, he looked around slowly, taking in the small collection of books on her shelf, the handmade quilt draped over her couch, the photographs of her family pinned to a corkboard near the window. There was nothing extravagant about the space, yet Dante studied it with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, as though trying to understand every piece of the woman who had unexpectedly become important to him. "It's peaceful here," he said finally, settling onto her couch as she brought over 2 cups of tea. "It's small," Elena said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing like what you're used to." "That's exactly why I like it," Dante said, a small, genuine smile crossing his face, one Elena had rarely seen from him before. "Everything about my life is loud, even when it's quiet. This feels honest." Elena sat down beside him, curling her hands around her warm cup, studying the man who had become such an unexpected presence in her life. "Do you ever wish you could just leave it all behind?" she asked. "The business, the reputation, all of it?" Dante considered the question seriously, his eyes drifting toward the window where evening light filtered softly through her curtains. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but walking away isn't simple. Too many people depend on the stability I provide, even if that stability comes wrapped in things I'm not proud of. If I disappeared, someone far less careful would take my place, and the people I've spent years protecting would suffer for it." "That sounds like a heavy weight to carry alone," Elena said softly. "It is," Dante admitted, "but it's the weight I chose, or the weight that chose me, depending on how you look at it. I stopped trying to escape it a long time ago. I only try to carry it as carefully as I can." Elena reached over without fully thinking about it, resting her hand gently over his. It was a small gesture, simple and unplanned, yet Dante went still beside her, as though the touch carried more weight than either of them expected. He turned his hand slowly beneath hers, lacing his fingers with hers in a quiet, tentative gesture that spoke louder than any words could have. "I don't know what this is," Elena admitted quietly, glancing down at their joined hands. "Whatever is happening between us, I wasn't looking for this." "Neither was I," Dante said, "but I'm not sorry it found me." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that. neither rushing to define exactly what was growing between them, both simply grateful for the quiet, steady comfort of the other's presence. For Elena, it was the first time in longer than she could remember that she felt entirely safe sitting beside another person. Safe not because of any promise of protection, but because of the honest, careful way Dante treated her, without demands, without control, without the shadows of fear that had haunted her previous relationship. For Dante, it was something rarer still, a moment of genuine peace in a life built almost entirely around vigilance and calculation. Sitting in Elena's small, honest apartment, holding her hand in comfortable silence, he found himself wishing, quietly and persistently, that this fragile peace could somehow last far longer than he suspected it would. The peace did not last. Nearly a month after that quiet evening, Elena was closing her shop for the night when she noticed a familiar figure standing across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a street lamp. Her stomach dropped instantly, recognition flooding through her before her mind fully registered what she was seeing. Marcus stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold, his posture different from before, sharper, more desperate. She did not run this time. She forced herself to walk calmly to her car, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear, though her hands trembled as she gripped her keys. He did not approach her that night, simply watched from a distance as she drove away, but the encounter left her shaken enough that she called Dante the moment she arrived home. "He's back," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "He was outside my shop tonight. He didn't come near me, but he was watching." Dante's voice, when he responded, carried a controlled calm that did little to hide the sharp edge beneath it. "Did he say anything? Did he follow you?" "No," Elena said. "He just watched." It felt worse somehow, knowing he was there and not doing anything. "I'll have someone at your shop tomorrow," Dante said immediately. "And I want you to stay somewhere safer tonight, if you're comfortable with that." Elena did not argue. The fear that had been dormant for weeks came rushing back with sudden, overwhelming force, and she found herself grateful, rather than resistant, for the protection Dante offered without hesitation. What neither of them fully understood yet was that Marcus's return was not simply about reclaiming Elena. Word had reached him, through channels neither Elena nor Dante had anticipated, about exactly who the man protecting her truly was. Rather than frightening Marcus away permanently, this knowledge had ignited something reckless and desperate inside him, a dangerous combination of wounded pride and stubborn refusal to accept that Elena had moved beyond his reach. Marcus began asking questions around the city, seeking out people who claimed to have connections to Dante's world, hoping to learn something, anything, that might give him leverage. He found men willing to talk for the right price, men on the fringes of Dante's organization who resented their position and were willing to share information they should have kept quiet. Through these connections, Marcus learned enough to convince himself that if he could somehow disrupt Dante's business dealings, he could weaken the protection surrounding Elena and reclaim what he still, foolishly, believed belonged to him. It was a reckless plan, built on desperation rather than sense, but desperation rarely listens to reason. Days later, Dante received word that someone had been asking pointed questions about his operations, questions that led directly back to Marcus. Victor delivered the news personally, his expression grim as he explained the situation to Dante in the privacy of his office. "He's trying to find a way to hurt you," Victor said, "or at least disrupt things enough to create an opening. He's talked to some of our lower people. Nothing serious was given away, but it's enough to know he's not simply going away quietly." Dante's jaw tightened, a flash of controlled anger passing behind his eyes, before settling back into careful composure. "Where is he now?" "We're not entirely sure," Victor admitted, "but he's been seen near one of our smaller properties on the east side. It's possible he's planning something reckless." Dante considered this information carefully, weighing the situation with the same measured calculation he applied to every decision in his life. Part of him wanted to handle this the way his world typically handled threats, decisively and permanently, removing the problem before it could grow into something worse. Yet another part of him, a part that had grown stronger since Elena walked into his life, hesitated at the thought of resorting to the kind of resolution his reputation suggested. He thought of Elena's face when she called him the night before, the fear still lingering in her voice, despite her attempts to sound composed. He thought of her quiet strength, her refusal to let fear control her life completely, and the trust she had slowly begun placing in him, trust built on the belief that he was different from the dangerous reputation that preceded him. "Keep an eye on him," Dante told Victor. "I want to know his movements, but no one touches him without my direct order. Not yet." Victor nodded, though his expression suggested he did not entirely understand the restraint Dante was choosing to exercise. In their world, threats were typically dealt with swiftly and without hesitation. Dante's careful patience was unusual, a deviation from the rules that had governed his decisions for years. That evening, Dante visited Elena at her apartment, his expression heavier than she had seen before. He explained the situation carefully, choosing his words with deliberate caution, unwilling to frighten her more than necessary, yet unwilling to hide the truth from her either. "He's trying to find a way to hurt your business," Elena said slowly, processing the information. "Because of me. Because of his own choices," Dante corrected gently. "None of this is because of you, Elena. This is about a man unwilling to accept that you no longer belong to him, and unwilling to accept consequences for actions that were always his own." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, old fears resurfacing alongside new ones. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "What are you going to do?" Dante hesitated, an unusual pause for a man normally so certain in his decisions. "In my world, there are expectations about how threats like this are handled," he said carefully. "Expectations I've built my reputation on meeting without exception." Elena's breath caught, understanding the weight behind his words. "And what do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to find a way to end this without anyone getting seriously hurt," Dante admitted, "including him." Elena studied his face, searching for any sign that his hesitation stemmed from weakness rather than genuine restraint. She found none. Instead, she saw a man wrestling with the expectations of a dangerous world against a growing desire to protect the fragile trust he had built with her, trust that would shatter completely if violence became the answer to every problem that arose. "Marcus hurt me in ways that had nothing to do with fists," she said quietly. "He controlled me, isolated me, made me feel like I couldn't trust my own judgment. I left him because I finally found the courage to choose myself over his version of what I should be. I don't want his story to end in more pain, even after everything he's done. I just want him gone from my life, completely and permanently." Dante listened carefully, weighing her words against the pressure building within his own world, a world that rarely tolerated mercy as a solution to problems like this one. Yet something about Elena's quiet conviction settled into him, strengthening a resolve he had been quietly building since Victor first brought him the news. "I'll find a way," Dante said finally, "one that doesn't turn this into something neither of us can undo." Elena reached for his hand, holding it tightly, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his presence despite the uncertainty hanging over both their heads. "Whatever happens," she said, "I trust you to choose the right path, even if it isn't the easiest one." Dante looked at her for a long moment, something resolute settling behind his dark eyes. He had spent years operating under rules that demanded certainty and swift resolution, rules that rarely left room for patience or restraint. Yet standing here, with Elena's hand in his, he understood clearly that whatever decision he made in the coming days would define not just the resolution of this immediate threat, but the kind of man he intended to become moving forward, both within his dangerous world and within the quiet, honest life he had unexpectedly begun building alongside her. The following days passed with tense uncertainty. Marcus grew bolder, no longer content with simply watching from a distance. He began sending messages to Elena's phone, vague and unsettling, reminders that he had not given up, warnings dressed as concern, threats disguised as declarations of love that had curdled into something far darker. Elena stopped responding to the messages, forwarding each one instead to Dante, who read them with a controlled anger that grew more difficult to contain with each passing day. Victor pressed him repeatedly for permission to handle Marcus directly, permanently, the way threats within their world were typically resolved. Yet Dante continued holding back, searching for a solution that would not betray the promise he had made to Elena. Then, one evening, the situation escalated beyond anything either of them anticipated. Marcus, growing increasingly desperate and unstable, attempted to confront one of Dante's men directly outside a property on the east side, demanding information about Dante's operations, threatening to go to the authorities with fabricated claims if his demands were not met. The confrontation ended without physical harm, but it confirmed what Dante had feared. Marcus was no longer simply a heartbroken man refusing to let go. He had become a genuine threat, reckless enough to endanger himself and potentially others in his desperate attempt to reclaim control over a life that no longer included him. Dante called Elena that night, his voice heavier than she had heard before. "Things have gotten more serious," he told her. "I need to resolve this soon, and I need you to trust me completely with how I choose to do it." Elena's heart pounded with uncertainty, torn between her trust in Dante and her fear of what resolving this situation might ultimately require. "Please," she said quietly, "find a way that doesn't destroy what we've built to get there." Dante closed his eyes briefly, feeling the full weight of her request settle over him. "I will," he promised. "Whatever it takes, I will find a way that lets both of us live with the outcome." Neither of them could yet know exactly how that promise would be tested in the days that followed, nor how close the fragile peace they had built together would come to collapsing entirely under the weight of Marcus's desperate, reckless refusal to let go. 2 days later, Elena received a message that made her blood turn cold. Marcus had discovered her home address, somehow slipping past the careful watch Dante's men had kept around her shop, and had left a note tucked beneath her apartment door, its words carefully chosen to frighten rather than threaten outright. The kind of message that gave nothing solid to report to authorities, yet carried an unmistakable weight of menace. She called Dante immediately, her hands shaking as she read the note aloud to him over the phone. His silence on the other end lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for Elena to sense the shift in him, the careful patience he had maintained finally beginning to strain under the reality of the danger closing in around her. "I'm sending Ellis to bring you somewhere safer," Dante said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Pack a bag. You're not staying there tonight." Elena did not argue. She packed quickly, her hands trembling as she gathered a few essential belongings, glancing repeatedly toward her door, as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. When Ellis arrived, he escorted her quickly to the car, his eyes scanning the street with practiced vigilance before allowing her to step outside. She spent that night at a quiet, unfamiliar apartment Dante kept for situations exactly like this one, a space secure and comfortable, yet undeniably lonely without him there beside her. Sleep came slowly and unevenly, her mind replaying the note's carefully cruel words over and over, until exhaustion finally overtook her sometime near dawn. The next morning, Dante arrived early, his expression grave as he sat across from her at the small kitchen table. "I spoke with Victor last night," he said. "There's a way to end this without anyone getting hurt, but it means using resources I don't usually reveal to outsiders." "What do you mean?" Elena asked. "Marcus has debts," Dante explained carefully. "Financial troubles he's kept hidden from almost everyone, including you. Enough leverage exists there to force him into a position where continuing this pursuit becomes impossible for him, not through threats of harm, but through consequences that matter far more to a man like him than pride does." The stars twinkled like scattered diamonds against the vast darkness of space. The stars twinkled like scattered diamonds against the vast darkness of space. "You're talking about ruining him financially instead of resorting to something worse." "Yes," Dante said. "It's not gentle, but it's permanent, and it doesn't require anyone to get hurt. I can make it so that every door closes for him in this city, professionally and personally, until leaving becomes his only remaining option." "Will it work?" Elena asked, though part of her already sensed that pursuing this path meant asking Dante to abandon the swift, harsher methods his world typically demanded, methods that would have been far easier for him to execute, and far more expected by the men who worked beneath him. "It will take patience," Dante admitted, "and it will cost me some respect among people who expect me to handle threats differently. But it's the right way. It's the way that lets us keep whatever this is between us, without building it on top of something we can't take back." Elena reached across the table, taking his hand firmly in hers. "Then that's what we do," she said, "together." Over the following days, Dante set his plan into motion carefully, calling in favors from contacts across the city, who owed him debts of their own, ensuring that every financial door available to Marcus quietly closed, without explanation. Business associates who once tolerated Marcus's unstable behavior suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. Opportunities he once relied upon vanished without warning, leaving him increasingly desperate and isolated. Victor, though initially skeptical of this careful, patient approach, eventually admitted a grudging respect for the effectiveness of Dante's strategy. "It's slower," he said one evening, reviewing the mounting pressure closing in around Marcus, "but it's thorough. He won't have anywhere left to turn soon." Elena remained cautious throughout this process, aware that cornering a desperate man carried its own risks, risks that worried her deeply, despite her belief that this approach was the right one. She voiced these fears to Dante one evening as they sat together in the quiet apartment, where she continued staying for safety. "What if closing every door makes him more dangerous, not less?" she asked. "What if desperation pushes him toward something reckless, instead of away?" Dante considered her concern seriously, understanding the legitimate fear behind her question. "That's why we're not doing this all at once," he said. "Each step is measured, calculated to leave him increasingly aware of consequences, without cornering him so completely that recklessness becomes his only remaining option. The goal isn't to trap him, it's to convince him that leaving is a far better choice than staying." Elena nodded slowly, trusting the careful thought behind his strategy, even as anxiety continued to simmer beneath her composed exterior. She understood, more clearly than ever, the immense complexity of the world Dante navigated daily, a world where every decision carried weight far beyond what most people ever had to consider, and where restraint required a discipline far harder to maintain than simple aggression ever would. As the days passed, small signs began emerging that Dante's strategy was working. Marcus stopped sending messages. The man who had once lingered outside Elena's shop stopped appearing altogether. Reports from Dante's men indicated that Marcus had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending most of his time indoors, his usual bravado replaced by visible anxiety as his options continued narrowing around him. Yet Elena knew, deep down, that this fragile calm would not last without one final confrontation, one last moment, where Marcus would either accept the reality closing in around him, or make one final, reckless attempt to reclaim control over a situation that had long since slipped beyond his grasp. That moment arrived sooner than either of them expected. Late one evening, as Elena finished restocking the shelves in her shop before closing for the night, she heard the front door open behind her, the small bell above it chiming softly. She turned, expecting a late customer, and instead found Marcus standing in the doorway, his appearance startlingly different from the confident man she once knew. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, his usual composure entirely gone. "Elena," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I just want to talk, please." Her heart pounded, old instincts urging her to run, yet something about his defeated posture kept her rooted in place, cautious but no longer entirely afraid. "You need to leave, Marcus," she said, keeping her voice steady, despite the tension coiling through her body. "I've lost everything," he said, ignoring her request, taking a step further into the shop. "My business, my contacts, everything I built. Do you understand what that's done to me? Because of him. Because of you running to him." "You did this to yourself," Elena said firmly, refusing to let old patterns of guilt take hold of her again. "Every choice that led here was yours, Marcus. I left because you gave me no other option." His expression shifted rapidly, between desperation and simmering anger, emotions warring visibly across his face. "I just need you to understand," he said, his voice rising unsteadily. "I need you to see what you've done." At that exact moment, the shop door opened again, and Dante stepped inside, having arrived only moments after receiving an alert that Marcus had been spotted near Elena's location. His expression, usually so carefully composed, carried a controlled intensity that filled the small space instantly. Marcus turned, his eyes widening at the sight of the man responsible for dismantling everything he once had. "You," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "You destroyed my life." "You destroyed your own life," Dante said calmly, stepping further into the shop, positioning himself carefully between Marcus and Elena without appearing overtly aggressive. Every consequence you're facing exists because you refuse to accept that Elena chose to leave you. That choice was hers to make, and yours to respect. I loved her, Marcus said, his voice cracking with raw desperation. Love doesn't chase someone through the streets until they're forced to run into a stranger's office for safety, Dante replied, his tone even despite the sharp truth behind his words. Love doesn't send threatening notes beneath someone's door. What you're describing isn't love, it's control, and control ends the moment someone chooses to walk away from it. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides, his entire body trembling with the weight of everything he had lost. Everything he refused to accept was gone. For a tense moment, it seemed as though the confrontation might spiral beyond words. Yet Dante remained perfectly still, his calm presence somehow more commanding than any aggressive posture could have been. You have two choices, Dante said quietly. You can leave this city entirely, start somewhere new, somewhere far from here, and I promise you'll be left alone to rebuild your life in peace. Or, you can continue down this path, and I promise you, that path leads somewhere far worse than the position you're standing in right now. Marcus stared at him, his desperate anger slowly giving way to a crushing recognition of how completely his options had narrowed. He looked toward Elena one final time, searching perhaps for some flicker of the woman he once believed loved him unconditionally, yet finding instead only quiet, unshakable resolve. This is really over, he said quietly, more to himself than to either of them. It's been over, Elena said gently, though firmly, for a long time now. Marcus's shoulders sagged, the last of his resistance draining away as reality finally settled fully into place. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the shop, the small bell above the door chiming softly as it closed behind him, marking an ending neither Elena nor Dante fully believed would arrive so quietly after everything that had led them here. In the weeks that followed, word eventually reached Dante that Marcus had indeed left the city entirely, relocating somewhere distant, attempting to rebuild whatever remained of his life, far from the two people whose paths he had disrupted so completely. There were no further messages, no further sightings, no further threats lingering beneath the surface of Elena's daily life. Victor, reviewing the final resolution of the situation with quiet reflection, admitted openly to Dante one evening that the outcome had surprised him. I expected this to end very differently, he said. I'm glad it didn't. Dante considered his words carefully before responding. So am I, he said. It cost us patience, and it cost me a bit of the fear people usually rely on to keep problems like this from happening in the first place. But it didn't cost either of us anything we couldn't live with afterward. That matters more than I used to think it did. For Elena, the resolution brought a kind of peace she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She returned to her shop each morning without the familiar tightness of fear coiled in her chest, without constantly glancing over her shoulder, without waiting anxiously for a threat that no longer loomed over her daily life. The flowers she arranged each day seemed to bloom more vividly now, or perhaps she simply had the mental space to notice their beauty properly for the first time in months. Her relationship with Dante, meanwhile, continued deepening steadily, built now on a foundation strengthened rather than weakened by everything they had faced together. Elena watched him navigate his complicated world with a newfound understanding of the careful balance he maintained daily, the weight of responsibility he carried, and the quiet decency underlying his choices, even when his world demanded otherwise. One evening, several weeks after Marcus had finally left the city for good, Dante invited Elena to dinner at a quiet restaurant tucked away from the busier parts of the city, a place he described as one of the few spots where he felt he could simply be himself, rather than the reputation that preceded him everywhere else. Over dinner, their conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and comfortable silences that spoke of a trust built carefully over months, rather than assumed carelessly overnight. Toward the end of the evening, Dante grew unusually quiet, studying Elena with an expression she had come to recognize as thoughtful consideration. I never expected any of this, he said finally. The day you ran into my office, I thought I was simply helping a stranger out of a difficult situation. I didn't expect that stranger to change the way I see my entire life. Elena reached across the table, taking his hand gently in hers. I didn't expect to find safety in the office of a man the whole city seemed afraid of, she said. But somehow, that's exactly what I found. Are you afraid of me? Dante asked quietly, an unusual vulnerability threading through his voice. No, Elena said without hesitation. I've learned the difference between power used to control someone and power used to protect them. You've never once made me feel like the second was conditional on anything I owed you. Dante's expression softened, something quietly emotional passing behind his usually guarded eyes. I want to keep being that for you, he said. Not because you need protecting, but because I want to stand beside you, for as long as you'll let me. Elena smiled, feeling the warmth of his words settle deeply into her chest, chasing away the last lingering shadows of fear that had followed her for so long. I think, she said softly, you already have been. Outside the restaurant, the city continued its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place within these two unlikely companions, one seeking escape from a life defined by fear, the other seeking meaning beyond a life defined by power. Neither of them had planned this ending when Elena first burst through his office door in desperate search of safety, yet here they were, standing together at the beginning of something neither had expected to find. Elena Voss no longer ran from anyone. She walked now, steady and unafraid, her hand resting comfortably in Dante Moretti's, the man once feared throughout the city now standing quietly beside her, not as the powerful boss everyone whispered about, but simply as someone who had finally chosen to stand up, not for reputation or power, but for the quiet, steady person who had unexpectedly become the most important part of his life. And as they walked together beneath the soft glow of streetlights that evening, both of them understood clearly that whatever challenges their unusual life together might still bring, they would face them side by side, no longer defined by fear, but by the steady, hard-earned trust they had built together, one quiet, honest moment at a time.